All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something, well, kind of puzzling, right?
Yeah, it's a head scratcher.
It is political polarization here in the U.S.
Yeah.
You know, like how it seems everyone's just stuck in their own camps.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. If you look back over the last century, this whole super intense divide thing wasn't always so intense. You know,
Right.
we had like high polarization way back in the early 1900s. Then things chilled out a bit after the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
But then, bam, in the last 30 years or so, it's like it's climbed right back up again.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive, I think, so interesting.
Right.
Because that recent surge in polarization doesn't seem to be because, everyone just suddenly completely shifted their core political beliefs, right? It's not like, oh, the country became overwhelmingly liberal or conservative.
Yeah.
So that leaves us with a pretty big question to unpack. What's actually driving this whole growing divide?
And that's where all this research you sent over comes in. Like this paper, Specialized Learning and Political Polarization.
By Sevgi Yuksel.
Yeah, by Sevgi Yuksel.
Mm-hmm.
This thing offers like a really compelling angle, don't you think?
I think so, yeah.
By looking at how these changes in what the author calls learning technologies might be a huge part of this whole story. And just so everyone's clear, when we say learning technologies, we're not talking about, like educational apps or anything like that.
No.
We're talking about, you remember that explosion of TV channels?
Oh, yeah.
That started in the mid-1980s and just kept going into the 2000s.
Kept going, yeah.
And then, of course, the internet, and then social media, and then the way we use, these digital news aggregators now.
Yeah, totally.
So the core of what we're looking at today, inspired by this research, is how all these shifts in the ways we find and consume information could be, get this, surprisingly, contributing to our political differences, our divides.
Right.
It's not just about having more information at our fingertips, which, you'd think that would.
Right.
You'd think it would help.
Yeah, more informed, less polarized.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it's really about the type of information we zero in on.
Yeah.
And how easily we can focus in on very specific areas, things we're already interested in.
Exactly.
And so our goal today, our mission for you, dear listener, is to really get a handle on the main ideas in this paper and connect them to these big overarching shifts in how we get our news these days.
All right.
We want to give you a shortcut, basically, to understanding this whole crucial dynamic, right?
Yep.
How the very same tools that could make us more knowledgeable might also be pulling us further apart.
Yeah. It's a paradox.
It is a total paradox. Okay, so let's unpack this thing. The paper starts by, looking at this big, monumental change in the information world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about it. Before cable and the internet really took off, really became ubiquitous, our news came from a pretty small number of sources, right? Few major newspapers, the big TV networks.
Yeah.
For the most part, everyone was kind of getting a similar picture of what was happening.
Same headlines.
Yeah.
Same basic stories.
Yeah, same basic narrative. But then things started changing.
Things shifted. Yeah.
Starting mid-'80s.
Yeah.
And then the internet comes along and it just explodes.
It explodes.
We see this incredible expansion of options. I mean, crazy, right?
It went from just a handful of channels to, hundreds.
Yeah.
And then with the internet to literally millions of potential sources.
Millions. And as the paper points out, this has led to a big shift towards what we might call personalized information.
Right.
People can really home in on those specific issues that they find the most important,
Yeah, exactly.
And this is regardless of what it is. You could be interested in, immigration policy, healthcare debate, foreign relations, whatever your thing is.
Yeah, it does matter.
You can find it.
Yeah.
And you can spend all your time just there.
Yeah.
In your little silo.
Exactly.
Which is interesting,
Yeah.
And what I thought was super fascinating is that the paper actually makes this historical comparison, right?
Right.
It reminds us that back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we had something kind of similar.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. We had all these super local, very specialized pamphlets and newspapers, which catered to these really specific needs and interests of particular communities,
So niche publications.
Super niche. But then as we move through the 20th century, these local outlets, most of them, gave way to those more I don't know, those consolidated like national news sources.
Yeah.
The kind of like media landscape that I think a lot of us just took for granted.
Right.
Before the digital age kind of came in and blew everything up.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like we went from this like specialization to consolidation, and now we're kind of swinging back towards specialization again.
Full circle, but with a different kind of technology driving it.
Exactly. With totally different technology.
Yeah.
And that leads us to, like, I think the central argument of this paper.
Okay, yeah.
Which is, how does this ability to really specialize in what information we're taking in, thanks to these new learning technologies, how does that actually lead to more political polarization?
Right.
Even if, like, our fundamental, like liberal or conservative views haven't actually changed all that much.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
That's the question. And to figure that out, we need to think about, like, the relationship between, political parties and the people who vote for them.
The voters.
The voters, yeah. Ideally, parties want to put the policies they believe in into practice.
Right, their platform.
Their platform, yeah. And often those are, like, on the more extreme side of things, right?
The stuff that really fires up their base.
Yeah, they want to keep their core people happy.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they also need to win elections.
Right, you need votes.
You need the votes, right?
Can't govern if you don't get elected.
Exactly. And to get those votes, you often need to appeal to, like, a broader range of voters.
You got to go beyond your base.
You got to go beyond, and that might mean toning down some of those stances, right?
Yeah, softening the edges a bit. Appeal to the moderates.
Exactly. So there's this like natural push and pull.
Yeah, balancing act.
They want to keep their hardcore supporters happy, but they also need to get those votes in the middle ground.
Right. Enough to actually get into power.
Exactly. And this is where the whole idea of, like, responsiveness comes in.
Responsiveness.
Yeah. It's like, how much does a party's chances of winning change if they, like, tweak their policy positions even a little bit?
Right. How sensitive are the voters to those changes?
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about when we say responsiveness.
That's what the paper's talking about. Yeah. Okay, so now the model in this paper introduces this idea that there's always going to be some uncertainty, about what the voters actually want.
Because it's not always clear-cut.
No, it's so messy.
People are complicated.
And it uses this multi-dimensional framework.
The multi-dimensional, yeah.
And by that, we mean it's acknowledging that voters don't just think along like a simple left-right line.
No, it's not that simple.
No, it's way more complicated. Like, people care about a whole bunch of different issues.
It's a whole spectrum.
It's a whole spectrum. And they care about them with different levels of intensity,
Right.
So instead of just thinking left or right, we're talking about a whole bunch of different, like, axes, right?
Yeah, axes of concern.
Axes of concern. So we have the environment, the economy, social issues, foreign policy, and even within each of those, you have even more specific concerns.
Yeah, it can get really granular.
So you might have some voters who are, like, super focused on economic issues.
Like taxes, trade, that sort of thing.
Like, that's their thing.
Right.
And then other voters, they might be way more concerned about, like, social issues, right?
Like abortion rights, LGBTQ plus, equality, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then within those broad categories, there's, like, a million smaller issues.
Yeah, you can really go down the rabbit hole.
Right.
Endless sub-issues.
So this is where we get to this idea of fractionalized societies.
Fractionalized societies, okay.
It's not just about whether people, like, identify as liberal or conservative overall, right?
Right.
It's about how much disagreement there is on which issues are the most important.
Yeah, where people's priorities lie.
Their priorities, like, think of it this way. Imagine two people.
Okay.
One person, they only care about, like, their local school board elections.
Okay.
The other person, they only care about, like, international trade.
Two very different focuses.
Totally different. So even if they're both, like, politically engaged,
right,
a national party shifting its stance on, say, healthcare, right, might completely miss their radar.
Yeah, it wouldn't even register.
No, it wouldn't matter to them.
Because it's not on their list of priorities.
It's not on their radar. So it's like that lack of shared focus.
Right, that fractionalization.
That fractionalization of, like, what we're paying attention to, that's key here.
It's about where we direct our energy, our attention.
So it's not about, like, the average opinion across the board, but about how diverse and spread out people are in terms of which issues they, like, really care about.
It's the heterogeneity of priorities.
Heterogeneity, yeah. And the paper's arguing that the degree of this fractionalization reflects how much, like, the distribution of preferences in a society differs
Yeah.
from that of a quote-unquote representative citizen.
The representative citizen.
This, like, theoretical person who, like, gives equal weight to all the different issues out there.
Right, a perfectly balanced individual.
Yeah.
Not a real person, more like a benchmark.
A benchmark, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously not a real person. But it helps us see how much, like, the actual diversity of our interests pulls us away from that center point.
Yeah, like how much we deviate from that ideal.
So it's the heterogeneity of, like, which issues we prioritize. That's really key here.
It's not just left versus right. It's about what issues we even consider relevant.
Exactly. And here's where the link to, like, this specialized learning comes in.
Okay, yeah.
The paper is saying that when people can, like, really specialize in the info they're taking in, you know,
Right.
like really focus on the issues they care most about, the electorate as a whole becomes less responsive to those broad party platforms.
Less responsive? Interesting. So why is that?
Because, well, think about it. Different groups are so intensely focused on their specific concerns that a party shifting its overall platform might not really sway voters whose attention is elsewhere.
Right. It's like they're tuned into a different frequency.
Totally, yeah. So, like, let's say, just for example, if I'm only reading news about climate change, right?
Okay.
A party's shift on, say, tax policy might not even, like, register with me.
Yeah.
Even if it would have, in a world where, you know, my news was more general and I was paying attention to more issues.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. Now, the paper also talks about the fineness of the learning technology.
Fineness?
Yeah. Basically, how deeply people can specialize.
Okay.
So can you just focus on, like, the broad topic of healthcare, or can you go deeper, focus on super specific sub-issues within healthcare?
Like, for instance?
Like the pricing of prescription drugs, or access to healthcare in rural areas.
Okay, so the more specific, the better.
Exactly. The more you can really drill down into the nitty-gritty.
The more you can become an expert in your little niche. Right.
Right, exactly.
But does that help or hurt is the question.
Well, that's what the paper tries to get at. It argues that this increased depth of learning actually contributes to polarization.
Really?
Yeah, and this specialization, it's not necessarily happening along that traditional left-right ideological spectrum, but across all these different policy sub-issues.
So it's like...
So you might become super knowledgeable about, let's say, international trade agreements, while your neighbor is deep into the details of local zoning laws.
Okay.
You're both informed, but about completely different things.
Yeah, so it's less about, like, where you fall on that liberal conservative scale.
Right.
And more about, like, what specific issues you've chosen to really become an expert in.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that this deeper learning allows citizens to better understand how their own, like, ideal position on these very specific sub-issues differs from the position of that, like, generalized representative citizen.
Right.
So their voting patterns become more divergent.
Well, like specific, you mean?
Yeah, more tailored to those specific issues. And this, in turn, reduces the electoral cost for parties to adopt more extreme positions overall.
Really?
Yeah, because they don't need to appeal to a broad consensus as much.
Okay, yeah.
When the electorate is basically broken down into these issue-specific groups.
I see. It's like if everyone's super focused on their own little thing, the parties can kind of afford to be more extreme because they know they just need to appeal to that specific group.
Exactly. They can cater to their niche.
So the more fine-tuned our learning is, the more we can specialize.
Right.
And the more, like, fractionalized society becomes.
Right.
In terms of what, like, drives our votes.
Yeah.
Even if our, like, underlying general political leanings haven't changed all that much.
Right.
That's a really interesting connection.
It is, right. And to really highlight this, the paper compares the effects of just having more information available versus being able to get specialized information.
Okay, interesting.
They use this, like, access parameter, which they call alpha, to represent how much information is just generally out there.
Okay.
And then they have this partition P.
Partition P.
To represent how fine-grained or broad our ability to specialize is.
So alpha is like the whole pool of info.
Yeah, the whole pool.
And P is like how specific we can get.
Exactly, how narrowly we can focus.
Okay.
So having more news articles about everything, higher alpha, that could make us, like, generally smarter voters.
Smarter overall.
Right. But being able to build our own personalized news feed, only focused on our pet issues, finer P, that could actually make us less responsive to the broader political landscape.
The broader picture.
The broader picture, yeah. The one the parties are trying to navigate.
Okay, so more general information can make us more responsive, potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
But more specialization, more power to filter, can make us less responsive.
Good, yeah.
Got it.
So if you increase alpha, if there's just more information out there in general, but our ability to specialize stays the same.
Stays the same.
You actually get a more informed electorate overall.
More informed, okay.
And this, in turn, increases responsiveness to policies.
Okay.
Because voters can hold parties accountable on a wider range of issues.
Because they know more about a wider range of issues.
Exactly. And this, the paper argues, leads to decreased polarization.
Decrease. Interesting. So more general information kind of pushes parties towards more central positions.
It could, yeah. Because if we're all more knowledgeable about a bunch of different topics, we're more likely to favor parties that take more mainstream approaches.
Makes sense, right? If you're well-rounded, you're less likely to go for the extremes.
Yeah, exactly. But the real kicker, the key finding here, is that when you increase specialization...
So make that partition P finer.
Right, finer P.
So we have more power to filter.
Exactly. And we keep access to information, the alpha, the same.
Same alpha.
You see the opposite effect.
Oh, wow.
Even though individuals might feel more informed on their chosen topics, the electorate as a whole becomes less responsive to those broad party platforms.
Less responsive.
And this, the paper argues, increases polarization.
Increases polarization.
So it's the ability to really laser focus on those niche issues.
Okay.
That seems to be a key factor driving this.
So it's not just the sheer amount of information.
Right.
It's the ability to silo ourselves into these specific informational niches.
Yeah, our own echo chambers, essentially.
That's kind of I don't know, surprising in a way, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Do you think more information would lead to more understanding, more common ground?
Right, you'd think so.
But it's the type of information we're consuming that seems to be the crucial element here.
It's not just quantity, it's quality, and how we filter that quality.
And the paper actually brings up some real-world data that supports this, right?
It do, yeah.
Surveys from the Pew Research Center show that, most Americans believe the internet makes them better informed on the topics they care about.
Right.
But then you look at studies like the one by Soman in 2016, and they don't really show big improvements in, overall voter knowledge, across a broad range of political issues.
We're getting deeper, but not broader.
Deeper, not broader.
Exactly.
Which, honestly, that rings true for me.
Yeah.
I know I can get, super into the latest developments in, I don't know, renewable energy technology, for example.
Sure.
But then my understanding of, agricultural policy.
Right.
Pretty basic.
Yeah. You have your areas of expertise.
Exactly. And the paper also points to this emerging research that uses machine learning to analyze, the actual content of different news sources.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And these studies, they're finding evidence of specialization in the content that information providers themselves are producing.
So it's not just that we're seeking out specific information, but the information itself is becoming more specialized.
The supply and demand of specialized information are both going up.
Feeding into each other.
It's a loop.
It is.
The paper also connects this research to other things that researchers have found about polarization, right?
Yeah, they put it in context.
They do. It mentions that, previous work has linked uncertainty about what voters want to political divides, and it kind of builds on that, right?
Yeah.
This paper does by suggesting that our understanding of what voters want is shaped by this whole process of specialized learning.
Right.
It also, acknowledges that there are other things that contribute to polarization, media bias, the rise of more extreme candidates.
Yeah, it's not the only factor.
It's not the only factor,
yeah.
But it emphasizes the unique role of this specialization in learning.
It's a new piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. It even mentions another paper by the same author, Perego and Yuksel, which looks at how information providers, when they're competing, might specialize their content even further.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, could lead to even more disagreement.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle.
So this isn't the whole story, but it seems like a really important piece of it.
A big piece, yeah.
Okay, so lastly, the paper talks about what all of this means for society as a whole.
Okay, yeah, the big picture stuff.
Right, the implications. So in their model, that representative citizen we talked about, the one who gives equal importance to all issues,
right,
their ideal policy, the paper says, is actually the best outcome for society.
Interesting.
And that's because of the symmetry in preferences they assume in their model. Meaning that, like this central point, this middle ground, it represents the most balanced and beneficial policy overall.
So any movement away from that center point, any increase in polarization, leads to a worse outcome for society.
According to the model, yeah.
Wow, that's pretty significant.
It is. And so they conclude that, increased access to information, higher alpha, actually improves things.
By reducing polarization.
Yeah, by reducing polarization, by bringing policies closer to that, socially optimal point.
Okay.
But on the other hand, increased specialization. Finer P. Yeah, more control over what we consume can make things worse.
By increasing polarization.
By increasing polarization and pushing policies further away from that ideal middle ground.
So even though we might feel like we're benefiting by becoming super knowledgeable about, our pet issues, the overall effect can actually be harmful to society.
It's like we're all getting smarter in our own little worlds, but we're drifting further apart as a whole.
Exactly.
That's a big takeaway, I think.
It is. And it really brings us back to the central insight here.
Which is?
Which is that while we might feel more informed because we can specialize in the news we consume, this specialization can actually contribute to greater political divides.
By making the electorate less responsive to those broader party platforms.
Exactly. It's a paradox.
It is a paradox.
Yeah.
We think more information is going to solve everything.
Right.
But it's not just about more information.
No.
It's about the kind of information and how we engage with it.
Exactly. So think about how you get your news.
Yeah, good point.
Are you mostly seeking out stuff on issues that you already feel strongly about? How might that be shaping your understanding of the bigger political picture?
Yeah.
And the motivations of different political parties?
Really good questions to ask yourself.
Does this perspective change how you think about, the current state of political conversations?
It definitely gives you something to think about.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in going deeper, we highly recommend checking out that paper we've been talking about.
Specialized Learning and Political Polarization.
Yeah, by Sevgi Yuksel. And look into some of the other related research on how we consume media and how it affects our political behavior.
Yeah.
This deep dive is really just a starting point, and there's so much more to explore on this topic.
It's a fascinating area of research.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.